Hi everybody, welcome to the Ramble. Before I get into what will be my primary topic for this video, I wanted to bring something cool to your attention. As most of you know who have watched my stuff for years, I am a huge fan of Superman Returns. It really is my favorite superhero movie, and I know it is much maligned and, to my way of thinking, very underrated by a lot of people, especially a lot of us internet people. Well, I found this podcast last week. It's from about a month ago, called In Defense of Superman Returns. It's actually the first episode of a new series of podcasts called In Defense of, and it's produced by Sideshow Sound Theater, which is a group of composers, and they also do podcasts called Sideshow Sound Radio that mainly deal with film scores and musical scores in general for movies and TV shows and video games and all sorts of stuff. And the In Defense of podcast about Superman Returns spends a lot of time analyzing the score for Superman Returns by John Ottman, with, of course, major themes adapted from the original Superman score written by John Williams. And that part of it is just fascinating and really interesting. And you can tell that the hosts know what they're talking about. They know music. They're very articulate. They're composers themselves. And they just do a great job. But they also talk about the movie in general, not just the music. And it's a really, really awesome show. It's about an hour and 10 minutes long. In Defense of Superman Returns. I could not have made a better defense of Superman Returns myself, and I did make a defense of Superman Returns myself, and I think theirs is better than mine. And they were kind enough to mention my What's So Bad About Superman Returns videos briefly at the end of their podcast, which is very nice of them to do, and it's the main reason why they contacted me to bring their show to my attention. But it's a really, really cool podcast just in general. And this particular episode, In Defense of Superman Returns, is highly recommended for me. If you want to hear people discuss film, and especially discuss film music in a very detailed and informed and articulate way, I could not recommend another show more highly than the Sideshow Sound Radio podcast, and in particular this In Defense of Superman Returns podcast. So that's my pitch for those guys in the beginning of the video. I hope you'll check it out. I found it to be just terrific. And now let's move on from Superman Returns and that sort of thing to what I really wanted to talk about in this video. The main reason why I'm sitting in front of this camera right now, and that is Star Wars. Huh? Did I get you? You thought I was going to talk about something important and political, and I'm just going to talk about Star Wars. What I wanted to talk about actually goes a little deeper than just Star Wars, but Star Wars is sort of my launch pad for it. I wanted to talk about the times in art, in popular art in particular, things like movie franchises or comic books, where the best thing that could possibly happen for a given creation is for it to be taken out of the hands of the person that created it. This cuts against to me, one of the most important principles of art and the creative process as it is typically thought about and understood today. And that is what is often called the auteur theory, the idea that the best things are the result of a singular vision of an artist. And I think that, generally speaking, this is a sound principle. I do think that the best things, speaking broadly, are the things that are auteured, that are the result of a single person's vision. But there are a few very, very high-profile exceptions to this rule, and I'm constantly fascinated when I think about things like Star Wars and Star Trek, and I could even throw Batman in there as well. And these are three of my favorite things, particularly Star Trek and Star Trek and Batman, but I love Star Wars too. These are creations that have reached unheard of heights of popularity that everybody in our culture knows about, that are the basis for films and television shows and books and comics that generate, hundreds of millions, billions of dollars in revenue on a regular basis. And in my opinion, and in the opinion of a lot of people, they only were brought to their full potential, both commercially and, many would argue, artistically, creatively, when they were removed from the control of their creators. And what got me thinking about this recently was just last week there was a news story that broke that Disney is finally going to be able to release the original unaltered pre-special edition versions of Star Wars The Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi on home video, on Blu-ray, for the first time. And if you recall, George Lucas himself, when asked about this a few years ago, said, well, it wouldn't be possible to release, a really high quality, digitally remastered, cleaned up print of the original pre-special edition trilogy. It wouldn't be possible to do that because when he went back and he produced the special editions beginning in 1997 and then subsequently in several more versions as the years went by, he altered the original negatives. The original negatives, he said, were destroyed when the special editions were created. Therefore, the original versions that were theatrically released in 1977 and 1980 and 1983 just simply don't exist anymore. A lot of people called bullshit on that at the time. A lot of people thought, well, that can't possibly be right. It sounded a little bit like an excuse from George Lucas, who didn't want to release the original trilogy in its unaltered form, because I think a lot of us sort of feel, and there's no evidence for this is just nerd speculation, but a lot of us feel like Lucas kind of resents the people who rejected not only the prequels, which were roundly rejected. Pretty much everybody over the age of 12 thought the prequels were garbage, and their reputations have only worsened as the years have gone by. But a lot of people also didn't care for the special editions either. The original trilogies, films in the original trilogy that were released with the updated special effects and, altered scenes and things like that, additional material, those were sort of rejected by a lot of people too. And I think George resented that, because George sees Star Wars as his. And he's right. I mean, he's right. Legally, morally, artistically, in any way you slice it, Star Wars is his. It's his creation. He, at least until recently, owned the rights to it. He still has some ownership of it, although he's sold it to Disney. Disney now has the ability to do with it whatever they please, pretty much. But it's always going to be George Lucas's thing. He created it. It's his baby, and he's right. And it's only reasonable that he should feel some kind of ownership over it, because it's his. But in my mind, and in the mind of a lot of people, the best work that was ever done on Star Wars was the work that George Lucas himself had the least to do with. And to me, that's The Empire Strikes Back. I think that is the best Star Wars film still by far. I don't even think it's that close of a call. I do really love the original Star Wars. I think Lucas deserves a lot of credit for that as the writer-director. But I think The Empire Strikes Back is the best Star Wars film that's ever been made. And I think it's not a coincidence that it's also the one that Lucas himself had the least directly to do with. And I think you can make a very similar argument, perhaps an even stronger argument, for that sort of thing in the case of Star Trek, which I prefer to Star Wars and always have and always will. I love Star Trek, and I think that one of the worst Star Trek writers was Gene Roddenberry. I think Gene Roddenberry did his best work before the first word of a screenplay was written. I think he created the premise. He created the characters, at least in their basic sort of types and their backstories. He came up with all of the framework, but then it was other writers and actors and directors and set designers and special effects guys who brought it to life and made it something fun and something exciting and something that people still cherish today, 50 years almost after it first appeared. It was not Gene Roddenberry that made it fly, so to speak. It was writers like Gene Coon and Dorothy Fontana, and much later in the Next Generation era, writers like Michael Piller and Ronald D. Moore and Ira Stephen Bear and Jerry Taylor and lots of other writers on the TV shows that I can't remember right at this moment off the top of my head, but were also incredibly important and I think deserve more credit than Gene Roddenberry does for the creative success of Star Trek, if not also the commercial success. And when we get to the movies, there's one name in the Star Trek movies that really deserves recognition. There are two names actually, but one in particular I've been thinking of lately because he just died recently, and that is Harve Bennett. Just a few days after the death of Leonard Nimoy, Harve Bennett died. And for those of you who don't know who Harve Bennett is, if you are a Star Trek fan and you don't know who Harve Bennett is, you should find out who Harve Bennett is, because you owe him for the fact that Star Trek is still a thing that exists, that people are using, that it's not just a dead property. It was Harve Bennett who conceived of the story for Star Trek II, who came up with the idea of bringing Khan back as the antagonist. It was Harve Bennett who got Nicholas Meyer to co-write and also to direct Star Trek II. Nicholas Meyer was the other name I was going to mention as being incredibly important to the Star Trek films, far more important than Gene Roddenberry, but even more important than Nick Meyer, I would say, was Harve Bennett. Harve Bennett, I think, was the most important writer and producer in the history of the Star Trek franchise, even more important than Gene Roddenberry, because unlike Roddenberry, who created Star Trek, Harve Bennett knew what to do with it. Harve Bennett understood how to make it work, how to make it compelling as drama, as cinema. And that's something that I think Gene Roddenberry never quite got. I think Gene Roddenberry had a very compelling vision that other, better, more talented people took up and made into something really memorable and really great. And I think the same thing was true for Batman. I think Bob Kane is another example. I think one of the worst Batman artists was Bob Kane. And it sounds so strange to say that, and it's so contrary to my philosophy of art and of creativity, where I do feel like the rights of the artist and the rights of the creator should be respected above all. But there are these instances where, as an audience member, I think the best thing that ever happened to a creation was when it was taken out of the hands of its creator. I think Star Wars is a great example of that. I think Star Trek is a great example of that. And I think Batman is a great example of that. I think Bill Finger was a tremendously talented writer. And I think there were incredibly talented artists who worked on Batman in the 40s when Bob Kane was still involved in the character. I mean, Jerry Robinson jumps to mind. But Bob Kane himself, I don't think was that great of an artist. And I don't think he had as solid a handle on the character as people who came after him. There are plenty of reasons to keep creative properties in the hands of their creators, but there are those exceptions, like Star Trek, like Star Wars, like Batman, and there are others as well. Those aren't the only ones, but those are the ones that stick in my mind because they're some of my favorite things, where sometimes the best thing you can do is to take it away from the person that created it. Sometimes the person that created it has no idea what to do with it. And the best thing you can do for the work itself is to give it to someone else who has a different take on it, who maybe isn't as close to it, who can view it with a little bit more objectivity and say, oh, if we just did this instead of that, it would work so much better and it would all click into place, as Star Trek did when it was placed in the hands of Harve Bennett instead of the hands of Gene Roddenberry. But of course, that's just my opinion. This is all completely subjective. That's one of the great things about discussing art and cinema and literature and things like that, is that ultimately when you break it down, it's all a matter of opinion. It's all how it makes you feel, how it makes you react to it, what you think of it. There is no objectively good or objectively bad when you're analyzing art. It's a matter of how does it make you feel, what does it make you think, and how are you able to best express those feelings? How can you articulate that to another person or to a broader audience? And that to me is fascinating and endlessly fun. And for all of the reasons I could give you why I prefer Star Trek as shepherded by Harve Bennett over Star Trek as shepherded by Gene Roddenberry, or why I prefer to know, why it comforts me to know that Star Wars is in the hands of Disney as opposed to the hands of George Lucas. There are people who could make the exact opposite case and could probably do it very well. Who could make a very strong, articulate case for why George Lucas was the ideal person to hold Star Wars in his hand, and why the prequels were not nearly as bad as people think they are, and why Gene Roddenberry was the one and only true visionary who should have been steering the ship at Star Trek, and why Bob Kane was the greatest Batman artist. Not one of the worst. How dare you say that about the man who created Batman? I'm sure there are people who could make those cases and do it very articulately and very impressively. And because of the nature of art and criticism, they would not be wrong. They would just be people with a different opinion. And I'm sure there are people who have those opinions and could share them. It's just that none of them seem to be on the internet.